Today's daf going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Samach Vav. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Shapiro in loving memory of her father, Albert Teichman, Zichrono Levacha, his 17th yahrzeit. He would love that on this day of his yahrzeit, my husband and I are en route to Israel to visit our daughter and her family. He was very proud of all his grandchildren. Today's daf is sponsored by Leslie Glassberg Nadel in loving memory of her sister Ruth Lewis, Rachel Bat Beryl Halevi Vitova, whose yahrzeit is the 7th of Kislev. May her memory be blessed. And today's daf is sponsored by Shiur Dishon in memory of her son, Eitan ben Shira, Hashem Yikom Damo, on his first yahrzeit. Eitan was a student at the Kiryat Shmoni Yeshiva, which he loved so much. In a wonderfully symbolic way, a day after the memorial, the Kiryat Shmoni Yeshiva, which was evacuated to the center of the country for more than a year, returns to Kiryat Shmoni with joy and dancing. Surely Eitan will join the joyful dancing from above. We're going to get started now with our daf. We were learning about different braitot. We had two different braitot, which we'll see the Gemara sort of calls them Resha and Seifa. It's possible, makes sense, by the way, that they were really part of one longer braita. And even though each one is introduced with a Tanu Rabbanan, which could mean they're two separate braitot or not, it's not really so important. But we went through all the ones that we said meant kesef, silver dinarim, and now we're doing the ones that refer to zahav. So there's different languages. If you remember, the first one talked about kesef, and then there was kesef dinarim, dinarim kesef, and then there was kesef bid dinarim. And kesef bid dinarim had a whole different interpretation. Instead of assuming it meant either one silver coin or two silver coins like the previous examples, but we assume this meant you want to give it in silver coins, but it's dinarim of gold. And then when it came to the gold, we had the exact same thing. We started with zahav, which just means gold, so we assume that means one gold coin. Then we had dahav dinarim or dinarim dahav, which means minimum 2 gold dinarim. I want to just remind you what's the ratio. The one gold dinar is worth 25 silver dinarim. So there's a big difference between them. And then when you say, and this was the big difference, dahav bid dinarim, gold in dinarim, we're going to assume, okay, now remember, kesef dinarim meant the value of 2 dinarim of gold in silver coins. Now it's going to mean the zahav b'dinarim is going to mean the exact reverse. It's going to be 2 silver dinarim, but give it in gold. Okay, that's what it's going to mean. So now we went through, we're just at the very bottom of Kuf Samach Vav. I'll just start there as a quick review. Amar mar dahav ein pachot dinar dahav. So if, right, zahav, it means 1 dinar of zahav. Manaska, why doesn't it mean maybe a brick of gold like we asked with the silver? And we answer in the same way. Amar Rabbi Elazar, the ketav matbeh. Rabbi Elazar says it must be you wrote coins, and that's how we know it's coins. If you didn't write coins, it could be it was a brick of gold and not necessarily gold coins. Ve'ema prute. Maybe it means gold prutot. This was also the same question we asked about the silver, right? Prutot are like pennies. Maybe it means gold pennies. Okay, now you might know, right? We don't have gold pennies. Nobody puts pennies in gold. People don't do that. Okay, prutot are usually made of copper. Sometimes they could be made of silver, and that's why we asked this question before with the silver, but certainly not. They're not really made of gold, right? And last time we answered by the silver. If you remember, it must be a place where they don't do them. They don't make prutot in silver, and that's why we don't assume it's silver prutot. But here we just say nobody ever makes gold prutot. Zahav b'dinarim. Now, we didn't ask this parallel question on the kesef. Maybe we're going to ask it now, depending on the version in the text you have. But let's ask the question first on zahav b'dinarim, which again meant 2 dinarim of kesef, but in the form of gold. Ein pachot mib'shnei dinarim kesef zahav. Okay, that's what I just explained. It's 2 dinarim of kesef in gold. But maybe he meant 2 dinarim of gold. So what would it be? Zahav bid dinarim, which we assume it means 2 different things. So we assumed, okay, zahav means currency or the coinage, and the dinarim must be something different. It must be silver. But now they're saying maybe the dinarim mean coins of gold, meaning 2 dinarim of gold, which would be 50 silver dinarim. In zahav must mean, if it's going to be something different, zahav must mean in pieces of gold taken from, let's say, a gold candelabra, and take off some gold from it. And maybe we mean like a chunk of gold type of thing. taken from somewhere else. That's what it means, pricha, like broken up gold. Okay, broken up chunks of gold, and for the value of 50 silver coins, which is 2 dinarim of zahav. So Amar Abaye, Ya Balashtar Latachtona. We don't say this because, and we're going to come back to this at the end of the daf as well, which is the person holding the star is always in the disadvantage position. Meaning, okay, why is that? Well, the person holding the star wants to get money out of somebody else based on what it says in the document. But we know the burden of proof is on the person trying to get the money out. So if we're going to say it's either 50 silver coins or 2 silver coins, we're going to obviously go with the lower amount of 2 silver coins, right? And not 2 gold coins. Okay. And that's what Abaye says. So now we have this in parentheses, but we're going to read it anyway, because it's very hard to read Rav Ashi, which is after the parentheses, without reading at least some of this. Reisha de katani kesef dinarim ein pachot mishnei dinarei zav kesef aman. Well, what about the previous one? Remember we said kesef dinarim means 2 dinarim in gold. Amai ema kaspa naska betray dinarei kaspa kamar. Maybe it means a chunk of silver in the value of 2 silver coins. In other words, why do we assume it means in gold? Okay, it never said gold there, right? So why did we assume? And also, what did we say there? It's 2 dinarim of zahav in the form of kesef. That's a very high number. If Abaye is right, that Yabal Ashara Tachtona, it said dinarim, it never said dinarei zahav. Why are we calling them dinarei zahav? We could just say, again, if you want to come up with some differentiation between the kesef and the dinarim, you could still call the dinarim of kesef, and it means in the form of a block of silver, just like we said now with the gold. So why are we saying there the number's really high? It's 2 gold coins and not 2 silver coins, again, meaning 50 dinarim instead of 2 dinarim. So again, question on Abaye. If he said Ya balashtar la tachtona, then why in the first part of the braita, or first braita we saw, however we read this, it seems to say otherwise. To which Amar Rav Ashi, which is going to lead us on a total tangent into Nida, and you're going to wonder why we got here. Reisha dekatav dinarei, seifa dekatav dinarim. Well, we're now amending the text of the first braita, because the first braita really doesn't make sense according to what Abaye just said. So the only way to say it is we're going to say it's clear there it's dinarim of zahav, as opposed to the second one where it's clear it's dinarim of kesef. And why is that? Because even though, if you look back on Amud Bet of yesterday's daf, you'll see that it says dinarim with a nun at the end. But what Rav Ashi explains is, no, it really says they're dinarei without a nun. And in the second braita, it says dinarim. Dinarim with a nun at the end is always a reference to silver. And dinarei, really they mean the same in Hebrew or in Aramaic, because a yud at the end is plural and a nun at the end is plural, a yud nun. It's the same thing. But what they're saying is that it was known in those times they differentiated between dinarei and dinarim in order to create less confusion, right? It's confusing. Call a dinar, right? And let's just take American coins. It's very clear, right? There's a penny, there's a nickel, there's a dime, there's a quarter. Each one is different. If you had a quarter that meant a quarter of $1 or a quarter of $10, it would be very confusing, right? You wouldn't know which quarter everybody's using. So you come up with some sort of way to call one a quarter and one quartera. I don't know, make up some word. But that's basically what they did. Said when we use dinarei, we mean gold. When we use dinarim, we mean silver. And that braita must have said dinarei and not dinarim. Okay. Where do we have this distinction? Minat temra. Dishane ben dinarei le dinarim. Where do we have this distinction between dinarei and dinarim? Well, Titania, and it's actually a Mishna. A Mishna in Nida. I think it's in Nida, actually. It's also in Keritut. Maybe it's in Keritut. Mishna in Keritut. Okay, fine. I have to go check. I think it's a Mishna in Keritut because I did look it up, and I think it's in Keritut. Okay, a Mishna in Keritut. I think the sugya comes up in Nida. Anyway, check after class. But Hayishasha. Okay, we need a lot of background for this. Okay, we're going to get off on a total tangent. You're going to have to remember because you're going to forget in a few minutes. because it'll take us a few minutes to get through this, that the whole reason we're here is to see the difference between dinarei and dinarim. But to get there, we're going to have to do some background. There's um, so it's in Keritut 8 Aleph, and right, it must be a Mishna there. Okay, it's a Mishna in Keritut. Now, we have a woman who gives birth, or a woman who's a zava. Okay, these are two women who have to bring sacrifices. So a woman who gives birth is very clear, although it's not so clear because it's either she gives birth. Okay, if you remember, there's tamei days where her bleeding is tamei, depending on 7 days or 14, whether it was a boy or a girl she gave birth to. Then there's tohar days, which is days where her bleeding, if she continues to bleed, she's actually pure, meaning she could be with her husband, but she can't go to the temple and eat sacrificial meat. Okay, she can't eat sacrificial meat at all. After that set of dam tohar days are over, which is either 40 for a male or 80 for a female, she brings a sacrifice. The sacrifice does two things, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The sacrifice, number one, is a matir. A matir means it permits her to eat sacrificial meat. Without that, she can't eat sacrificial meat. So it permits her to eat sacrificial meat. And also, it's just an obligation. Okay, whether or not you need the matir, you're still obligated to bring it. So it's got two elements there. A zava is a woman who, and it's not just a woman who gives birth, it's a woman who miscarries after day 40 of pregnancy, which we're going to get to. The first case we're going to get to is a woman who's suffix whether she needs to bring this or not. And that's because she doesn't know how pregnant she was when she miscarried. Okay, she's not exactly sure. It was around day 40. She can't say for sure exactly what day. So that would be a suffix case. Now we have zava. What's zava? This is a woman who bleeds when it's not her nida days. It's not her general menstruating time. She bleeds for more than 3 days. She's called a zava gdola. She has to wait 7 clean days and then bring a sacrifice. Okay, whereas a nida, first of all, doesn't need the 7 clean days. Nowadays, all women are what we call suffix zavot, potentially maybe, and you'll see why in a minute. But so hold off on that for 1 minute. And Anita doesn't bring a sacrifice. Okay, every month the women didn't have to bring sacrifices every time they got out of menstruating, but a zava does, and a zava brings a korban, and again the korban permits her to eat sacrificial meat. Without that, she can't. She's permitted. She's sort of a tum'ah of a sense that also prevents her from eating sacrificial meat, and the bringing of the sacrifice permits that. Zava, it's a little bit unclear sometimes how to. It's unclear how to count zava days and nida days, how you know whether it's your time you're menstruating or not your time you're menstruating. And that's why all women nowadays are considered suffix zavot. We're not exactly sure how to count what's considered when it's your period, what's considered when it's not. And therefore, we always wait 7 clean days. Now, therefore, we're going to have a situation in those days, right? You had to bring a sacrifice. So the woman wasn't clear on what her zava days were, what her nida days were, and therefore she's a suffix zava. So now we have the Mishna that says, and I see, Ruth, you're telling me that it's also in nida, so it's possible that's why I was confused by the whole thing. Okay, so thank you. And I just want to check one thing here. It appears in both places, I guess. Yeah, let me just see. Okay, anyway, we'll leave it right now. So ha'isha shayu ala safek chamesh leidot safek chamesh zavot. We now have a woman who's not sure if she miscarried. Obviously, it's only a miscarriage. You'd be sure if you gave birth 5 times, but she wasn't sure if when she miscarried many, many times. Oh, okay. Sorry. It's not nida. This is a complete presentation of the Mishna in Keritut. Okay, fine. I think this sugya might come up in nida. Is that why I think? I don't know why I connect it with nida. Maybe just because it's a nida issue, but okay, leave it. It's a Mishna in Keritut. Done. So the woman had safek chamesh leidot, safek chamesh zivot. So she's not sure if she was she gave birth, miscarried 5 times. She's not sure. She had bleeding. She wasn't sure if it was zava blood or nida blood. So theoretically, she has on her the issue of bringing a sacrifice. What's the problem? Well, now let's talk about the sacrifice she brings. She brings 2 birds. One is an ola, one is a chatat. Okay, it's a pair of birds. It's called kinim. There's all masechet kinim, which we're going to learn only the Mishnayot of. It's part of the Daf Yomi cycle. We'll get there, Ezrat Hashem, closer to the end of the cycle. So we have a few years. So it's called kinim. It's a pair of birds. And the main sacrifices, I mean, there's some other times, but it's usually for the yoledet and the zava that bring these pairs of birds. Now, one's an ola, a burnt offering, and one is a chata. Now, when you want to bring a sacrifice that you're not sure if you're obligated to bring, what you generally do is you say, if it's an obligation, then this is for my obligation. If I'm not obligated, this is a voluntary offering. What's the problem? There's no such thing as a voluntary chatat offering. You can bring a voluntary ola offering. People did that all the time. But chatat is a sin offering. You only bring it. This woman didn't do a sin. That's a whole other question. Why the yoledet and the zava bring a sin offering, but we're not going to get into that right now. But there's no such thing as a voluntary sin offering, misafek. Well, I shouldn't say there's no such thing. Okay, now what's the issue? The issue is you're not allowed to bring chulin la'azara. You can't bring something that's not a sacrifice into the temple. You can only bring sacrifice. We're not sure if it's really a sacrifice or not, it's a problem. They made a special exception with the chatat ha'of, and they allowed chatat ha'of to be brought misafek, but there's one issue with it, which is a chatat ha'of can be brought in a safek situation, but usually the sacrificial meat is eaten of the chatat by the kohen. Okay, that's what happens with the chatat. It goes to the kohen, whether it's an animal offering or a bird offering. But in this case, because it's a safek chatat, we have a problem, which is what? The kohen can't eat this. Now, why can't the kohen eat the meat? It's very clear. Because, okay, but you have to know laws to understand this. In an animal sacrifice, it's fine. The kohen can eat the meat because it was sacrificed, right? And it was slaughtered. It was slaughtered kalacha. But if this isn't a sacrifice, now you have to understand how they did birds when they were in the temple. They did bird sacrifices not by slaughtering them. They would do what's called malika. Malika was a special way of slaughtering or of killing the bird, where the kohen would take his thumb and the back of the neck of the bird. We'll get into all that later. And would kill the bird in that way. Now, this is only permitted for eating if it's a sacrifice. You can't do malika outside the temple. So if you brought this sacrifice, which could not allow you to bring because of a special dispensation for a chatat, but the meat can't be eaten. Okay, so what? Well, if the meat can't be eaten, I told you we need a lot of background for this. If the meat can't be eaten by the kohanim, then it has to be buried. Now, okay, fine. So we're good. In other words, we're allowed to bring this. The kohen can't eat the meat, we bury it. But there's another problem, which is you're not allowed to create a situation where you know in advance that your sacrificial stuff is going to end up being burnt. Okay. If something happens, like it becomes impure and by accident, you have to burn it. Okay. But you can't do something knowing from the beginning, that you're going to have to bury it. That's not a nice way to treat kodshim. We don't, right? It's the most respectful way to treat kodshim to get ruined. But you can't know going in to do it unless we have some extenuating circumstances, like our situation, where we want this woman to be allowed to eat sacrificial meat. We don't want to leave her for the rest of her life without being able to eat sacrificial meat. So that's what's going to lead us to our case. So let's just go back. So we have this woman who might owe 5 sacrifices, but she might not. We don't know. So what do we do? So she brings her first sacrifice. She brings 1 misafek, which permits her to eat sacrificial meat, and we're going to let that go, even though we're going to have to bury this meat now, right? And we're going to have to bury it and treat it like that, even though knowing going in that that's what was going to happen. But, which again, I'm just going to review. We have to bury it because no one can eat it. Why can no one eat it? Because malika was done to it and not shchita. And if it wasn't really supposed to be a sacrifice, because we don't know, it's 50-50, let's say, so the kohen is not allowed to eat it, right? In general, only the kohen's allowed to eat chatat meat, but the kohen can't eat this meat because maybe it's what they call nevela, unslaughtered meat, because malika was done to it. So if it wasn't meant to be a korban, if it was meant to be a korban, of course, the kohen can eat it. But since there's a 50-50 chance it wasn't meant to be a korban, therefore the kohen can't eat it, it has to be buried. We're going to allow that because that, yes, will allow you to bury something if there's some important value. And what's that? That she needs to get permitted. She needs this matir of the korban. However, okay, imagine a woman who didn't go to the mikvah 5 times, okay? So if she goes to the mikvah once, does that make her tahor? Of course, she doesn't need to go 5 times to matir. So just like the mikvah, she would only have to go once. The sacrifice is only needed once in order to permit her to be pure. The Rashban makes that comparison to mikvah. It's a good comparison. So, but what's the issue? What about all the other korbanot? Well, hash'al, what do we do with the other? Ein hash'ar aleha chova. But she's not obligated to bring the rest because once she's permitted to eat the sacrificial meat, we don't need these anymore. Yes, it's true, perhaps she's obligated by the Torah to bring a korban, but since those korbanot are all going to end up being meat that's going to be buried, we don't want to allow her to do that. They're not as critical as the first one. First one we let her do. What if hayu aleh chamesh leidot vadaot? If she had 5 definite births that she just didn't get to the temple, she was, like to think of it as she was too busy dealing with her kids, right? She had child after child after child. It was just too busy to make it to the temple. Or again, it could have been miscarriages. V'chamesh zivot vadaot, or 5 times she was a zava and just never took care of her sacrifices. So again, the first one already is the matir. That permits her. She can now eat sacrificial meat. But she's still obligated to bring the others. In other words, she can eat sacrificial meat immediately, but she still has an obligation because there's 2 things going on here. There's number 1, the korban, and number 2, there's the obligation of the korban, and there's the matir, the permitting her to eat sacrificial meat. Okay, why are we here? Remember, dinarei, dinarim. Okay, you might wonder what this has to do with anything. Well, we have a great story that's going to come. We're finally there. There was a case where there were so many women who needed to do these sacrifices, and presumably, we're going to see from the continuation, there were a lot of women who needed to bring multiple sacrifices. So if you think it was a joke, the women were too busy to bring their sacrifice. Not such a joke. This apparently was commonplace, that women would wait and they would kind of get backed up and they would need a lot. And as we all know with economics, what happens? So the demand goes up. Everybody wants kinim. So the people selling the birds raise the prices. And they started costing. Now you have to remember in the Torah, there's always like on the sliding scale offerings, right? These are the cheap sacrifices. Well, they went up to dinarei zahav. They went up and they were already priced in dinarei zahav. Okay, the price went very high. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Now you have to remember who he was and why he's the one who did this. He was a Nasi, right? The Gamliel, the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, they were all, right? His son was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. They were all the Nasi, which means they're not only the rabbi leader, but they're also political leaders, and they had to deal with issues that came up in the community. So here you see Rabban Shimon Gamliel taking a firm stand. He says, Hama'on hazeh, this place, which is really just a language of taking an oath, like I swear, Im alin halayla, will not go to sleep tonight at dinarim, until they go down to dinarim. Okay, there's our answer. Dinarei zahav and dinarim. Okay, there you see, dinarim obviously means silver. He wants to switch it from the gold dinarim to the silver. He wants to cut the price by a lot. Nichnas lebeitim v'limed. So what did he do? He goes into the court and he teaches a halacha against what we learned in the Mishna. And he says, Haisha shayu al chamesh leidot vadaot, chamesh zivot vadaot, this woman who's now obligated to bring 5 sacrifices, mevi'ah korban echad v'ochelet b'zvachim, ve'ein hash'ar aleha chova. He basically says this woman is not obligated to bring 5 sacrifices. If you bundle them all up together, bring 1 and that's it. Okay, fascinating. He changes the halacha and a sacrifice that theoretically she's obligated by Torah law, he changes in order to drop the prices, to make halacha manageable for people, right? Because it just wasn't manageable that all these, imagine also, many people in the world give birth, and a lot of these people just couldn't afford once the prices got so high. Turning now to Amabet, get to the punchline of the story. Amdu kinim bo bayom beriva atayim. They all dropped to a quarter of a dinar. Okay, great story. He basically intervenes, changes a law, presumably a Torah law, and basically drops it down, drops the prices exponentially, right? They drop from being in gold dinarim, which again, 1 gold dinar is 25 silver dinarim, which isn't even clear, right? If it was even more than, because it says dinarei zahav. It's not even clear if it was more than 1 dinar zahav, and they dropped to a quarter of a silver dinar. Okay, and with that, he really succeeded in resolving this problem in, a snap of a finger. Okay, that's a good story. And all it brought here was this issue of the dinarei and dinarim. But obviously, the Gemara wanted to bring this because it's a really interesting story about the importance of people being able to function within halacha. And it's a totally disconnected story. But we were talking over Shabbat about a daughter in the army was saying how they always have these things that people have to pay money for. Like they go out for an evening with the staff and then she has to pay money for a restaurant for a meal, and that it's unfair that here she's in the system and she's forced to shell out money when she makes, a not a high army salary. And anyway, I was thinking about it. It's the same kind of thing. Like you're in a system that forces you to have to pay high prices for really no good reason. Okay. It's just always fun to connect, things are always connecting in our heads when we learn things and then we're having conversations outside. Okay. Now we're back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah at the bottom of Kuf Samachay had said the following. Let's just read it inside. We'll go back for a minute. Now we're going to talk about contradictions in the top and the bottom of the document. So at the top it says 100, at the bottom it says 200, right? The bottom is having some sort of summary or repeating what it said in the document, but the number is different. It doesn't matter which is at the top, which is at the bottom. And we said because we assume that the person meant to change it. They were writing the document and then they changed their mind about how much money the deal was going to be for. And they wrote at the end is the last thing they wrote, we're going to go by that. However, Mishna says in Ken Lama Kotvi Mitalion, so why do we write the part at the top at all then? In case there's a letter that gets erased at the bottom, we'll learn it from the top. So we're starting off with that line. This braita kind of is going to qualify that line. Tanu Rabbanit. Yilmad tachton min al-yon. When can we learn from the top of a document? Be'ot echat, if it's one letter. Aval b'shtei otiot, if two letters get erased. Kigon chanan me chanani. Okay, if you have chanan and chanani or anan me anani, where basically you're right. If it's one letter difference or two letter difference, right? That's a one letter difference. Chanan and chanani or anan and anani. So here you notice they're not only talking about numbers and digits, but they're also talking about names. So if the person's name at the top was Hanan, at the bottom it's Hanani, that would work. But if the person at the top is named Chen, and then at the bottom they're named Hanani, which is the opposite. The bottom they're Hanan, and two letters are missing, and at the top they're Hanani, then we can't learn from the top part. So now the Gemara is going to ask, why are two letters a problem? Is it because, right, we assume Dilma Mitrame Shem Ben Arba Otiot Vavale Palga Dishma, right? If we have the name Hanani and instead it says Chen at the bottom and Hanani at the top, that's already half the name. That's already significant. Well, if that's the case, you could have the same problem with one letter difference. Because you could have, let's say, Chet and Chen, which is also half the word, right? But you could have a name Ben Shtei Otiot. If the whole issue is it's half a name, well, one letter could be a problem as well because there's a lot of two-letter names. Dan, Chen, right? There's all sorts of two-letter names. And if one letter gets cut off, it would also be half the name. So why did they make this rule two letters, no, yet one letter, yes? To which they answer, the issue is for the three-letter name. And then once we have a concern with this, we're going to just not allow it ever, right? That's the general. We call that lo pluk. Okay? Even if it's, a fifth of the word, it's a really long name, it's still going to be a problem. But the main reason here is because there it's already more than half. Half wouldn't bother us. That's why one letter is always fine, because one letter can never be more than half the name. But two letters can actually end up being more than half the name. It could be 2/3 of the name is missing, and that we wouldn't want to allow. So, like if you had Chet and Chanan, right? That would end up that your word is missing more than half of the word, and therefore we wouldn't allow it. So that's the difference between one letter and two letters. One thing that's interesting about the sugya is it doesn't tell you in the sugya, so what if there's one letter at the bottom and two letters, right? Let's say three letters at the top, so two letters difference. So we just said that doesn't work, right? You have a ched at the bottom and chanan at the top. So what does it mean it doesn't work? Okay, or you would need a different one. Let's try chen and chanan. Okay, two-letter difference. You have a name chen at the bottom. You have Hanani at the top. Okay, chet doesn't work because chet's not really a name. But let's say there was a name at the bottom, and it's just different from the name at the top, and it differs with two letters. So according to this, you can't learn from the top and say it's Hanani. So then what is it? Is it chen or is it invalid? So that's a machlok at the Rashbam and Tosfot. Okay, because it doesn't tell you, right? Does it just revert back to what again, let's just go back. The Mishna said, this is a good review. If it says a different number at the top and the bottom, right, we're going to go by the bottom number because we're going to assume that the person changed their mind. So we're going to assume the same thing about two otiyot if there's two letters different, okay, not different amounts, but two letters different, or maybe two digits different or something like that. Right here, they seem to be talking about the name and not so much the numbers, but maybe it's the numbers as well. And then, then we're going to go and we're going to say, oh, yeah, it goes. Then we go back to the basic halacha. We're going to learn from the last one because it must be the person changed their mind. That's the Rashbam. But Tosfot says, no, it's just an invalid document because you have this discrepancy that two letters are missing. And it's such a big difference that we're just going to say the document's invalid and no one can do anything with this document. So it's interesting because it's just a good case where the sugi doesn't say it and then the commentaries go off in different directions. Amar Rav Papa. Pshitali, sefel milamata, sefel milamala, v'kefel milamata, hakol holech achar tachton. With pshita is not going to be as interesting yet because you always don't. Okay, well, that's obvious what's not. Sefel, okay, first of all, there's a lot of different definitions. What's a sefel? What's a kefel? It's not so important for us. Kefel's with a kuf. Okay, that's really important to know if you're not reading it inside and you're listening to me. So you'll see why in a minute. Sefel, let's just go with the simple. Sefel is a mug, a cup, and a kefel is clothing because it gets folded. Kefel from a folds, okay? And it's something that gets folded. Let's just say it's a garment, okay? But there's many different interpretations what these words mean. Like I said, it's not so significant. If it says sefel at the top and it says kefel at the bottom, so then we go by the basic halacha. Hakol olech achar tachton, right? That's a difference of one letter. And, right, it's not like a letter's missing, but there's a difference of a letter. We're going to go by the bottom. By Rav Papa, but Rav Papa asks, kefel, as Rav Papa started off saying, I get this. This is obvious. But what if it's kefel milamala v'sefel milamata? It's kefel at the top, sefel at the bottom. What's the difference? Well, if you're a sofer, you'll understand the difference. Now, a samach is like a straight line with, a circular shape at the bottom. A kuf is a line with a circular shape, circling in toward the bottom like a samach, and then a line going straight down. So to a certain extent, it has a very similar shape, but the kuf kind of juts out at the bottom. So they say here, michashinan lezvuv olo. Are we concerned if it says sefel at the bottom, maybe it really was kefel? And what happened? While it was still, yes, and there's an excellent picture in the Koran. Thank you for reminding me. There's an excellent picture there. While your ink is still wet, maybe a fly came, or some sort of insect, and kind of smeared it upward. And now there's no kuf jutting out at the bottom. It looks like a samach because basically, if you move that upward, then it's going to look exactly like a samach. So are we worried about that or not? And the answer is teku. We don't know. So again, the default is we follow the bottom, but perhaps not if there's a reason why there would be. We can explain away why it looks like this from just simply the way scribes work and ink works and the way it could have been moved by a bug. Okay. Now we're going to end with this other case that happened. And we'll continue a little bit in tomorrow's daf and finish it. It goes into the third line of tomorrow's daf. Another issue with an unclear star. That's basically our topic for today. We have some sort of lack of clarity here. So the star said that, let's say it's a loan. Somebody borrowed 600 and a zuz. Now, the question is 600 what and a zuz? Okay, it's 600 something and a zuz. Now, you might say the simple is it's 600 and one zuz would be 601 zuzim. But it's not so clear because it says 600 and one zuz. So it's not really clear what it means. So Shachar Rav Shrevya Kamed Abai, Rav Shrevya sends us to Abai and says, Shit mea istira v'zuze, o dilma shit mea prita v'zuze. He brings two possible extremes. He says, is it 600 istara, which is, an istara is a sela. A sela, if you remember, is 4 zuzim. I want to remind you, zuzim and dinarim are the same. So let's just talk in dinarim because that's what we've been discussing. It would be 600 times 4 dinarim, 2,400 dinarim, and a zuz. That's a lot more, right? Or is it 600 prutot and a zuz? Now, 600 prutot would mean 6 zuzim plus 1 more zuz. Okay, maybe it means that. Maybe it means the coins, right? Like pennies, right? He doesn't even offer the option of 600 zuz and a zuz. That would be 601 zuzim. But some versions of the text do have that as 3, that he actually did offer 3 possibilities, and it actually makes the most sense. So Amarle, especially with the continuation, also in the continuation, you're going to see this parentheses and lack of clarity, but we'll see. Amarle dal priti delo kativ b'shtara da suke miskan lahu. He says nobody writes prutot in a shtar unless it's like the remainder. But instead of writing 6 zuzim, nobody would ever write in a shtar 600 prutot. That's just not the way people write documents. They always transfer them into the higher currency, okay, or the higher coinage. So that's a suche misken lehu. Okay, they would convert it. Thank you. I'm finding the word. They would convert it to the zuzim or the dinarim. So it doesn't make any sense that you would say prutot. So I'm getting that off the table. Umashavele zuze. Okay, turning now to the next stop, and they would turn that into zuzim. Maya Mart. Now, what's your other possibility? Shit mea istere v'zuze. You want to say it's 600 slaim, which is 2,400 zuzim and 1 more. Okay, now I'm going to read the parentheses because it's hard to read it without this. Or shit mea zuze v'chad zuza. Or you're going to say it's 600 zuzim and a zuz. Ya bala shtar la tachtona. Well, again, go back to where we started. Remember Abaye, and it's the same Abaye who said it before. The person holding the document always has the disadvantaged position. So we can't allow the person holding the shtar to collect 2,401 zuzim based, right, dinarim, based on what it says in the shtar. So therefore, we're going to go with zuzim. Okay? Now, if you don't read those words, you're still going to say that he said, Shemei Isra v'zuzeh, that's way too much. And then you're going to have to say, well, it's not prutot, it's not Isra. And if that's all the person asked, then you're a little bit stuck. So then what is it? But it seems that no matter what, you would get to the conclusion that Abai is just going to say, we can't demand that much, so we must just end up saying it's 601 zuzim, okay, or 601 dinarim, which, as I said, is the same thing, and that's his conclusion. Okay, so what did we do today? We started with this zahav v'dinarim and trying to figure out, right, how we got to the fact that it's dinarim of kesef and zahav, and that's because ya bala shtar la taktona. What about in kesef, though? How do we demand so much money then? And the answer is, right, when we said kesef dinarim, we said it's dinarei zahav, 2 dinarei zahav in silver coins, which was 50 dinarim. There we took a larger amount because there it must have said dinarei, according to Rav Ashi, and there it said dinarim. And from there we got to the Mishna in Keritut, which was all about the difference between dinarei and dinarim. Again, that wasn't really the main point of the Mishnah there, but we got to, from there, the story about Rashbag, how we changed it from dinarei zahav to, right, he wanted to change the price to dinarim, to silver. And that's where we saw dinarei, dinarim, and we saw this great case of a rabbi coming in and really changing the law in order to resolve an economic crisis that was going on. And then we got to the tachtom and alyon, and basically you can learn the reason why we put the same words in the top and later on in the document is to prevent any sort of confusion, right, in case something gets erased. But we can only use the top when it contradicts the bottom if it's a difference in 1 letter, not if it's a difference in 2 letters. And that's because 2 letters could be the majority of a name already. And therefore, we don't want to allow using the top to teach about the bottom. So then what do? Like we said, machloket. Either it means the document's totally invalid because there's this lack of clarity, or we just go by the bottom, which was the standard that we said previously, because again, we assume that something changed and the bottom reflects the end and what they decided to do in the end. And then we talked about the difference between the sefel and the kefel and the possibility that maybe, even though normally we're going to follow what it says at the bottom, perhaps if the bottom one looks like it could have been a different letter and just got messed up by a bug, then maybe we would allow this, but maybe we would follow the top in that point, but it's not clear. And then we ended with the story of what do you do when it doesn't say the currency? And again, the principle that Abaye uses, and as he employs logic, like Number one, what would you expect to appear in a star? Certainly not prutot. Number two, though, we're going to say ba'al shtar la tachtona, so we're going to find some middle ground. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov and Shnishma B'Serot Tovot.